All right, I think we can get started at least with a brief introduction and overview. My name is Michaela Nondo Erskog. I'm a member of the No Cold War Coordinating Committee, which is a peace platform that's trying to promote different forms of exchange between people across the world and discussions around critical themes around calls for peace, building lasting solidarity networks, and basically trying to confront some of the warring tendencies in the world when right now the world more than ever needs to be seeking forms of cooperation and collaboration over war and militarization. I'm also a researcher at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. So I'm excited to host this discussion. I'm really interested to hear what all the speakers have to say, who are all accomplished peace activists, thinkers, public commentators in their own right. And so I think we're going to get straight into it. But I would like to remind everyone that part of the reason we had this event is that at Tricontinental, we did a collaboration and produced a dossier on the role that the US is playing in destabilizing East Asia. And that prompted us to try to bring different voices from across not only East Asia, but as well as the Pacific, who are people who are leading voices in terms of calling for peace and organizing for peace. And so we thought that prompted by this discussion document, we could have a fruitful discussion and try to kind of understand a little bit better what the situation is, but also to think about what are the pathways forward and what needs to be done in terms of people who are active in the peace movement across the world. So our first speaker is going to be Daehan Song. He is a No Cold War Coordinating Committee member alongside myself. He was also the author of the text that I mentioned, which you can find at thetricontinental.org, and it is available in quite a few different languages, so do check it out. And Daehan Song is also a member of the International Strategy Center based in Seoul, and he will be starting our conversation by giving us a kind of broad historical overview of the US and the role the US has played in East Asia based on the dossier. So each speaker will speak for about 8 minutes. We will then have a second round where we have some concluding remarks for 3 minutes. And so I hope the discussion is fruitful for all those participating as well as those who are in attendance. So I'll hand over to Daehan now for 8 minutes.
Hello, hi. Thank you for having me. So my presentation is gonna be based on the dossier that I've written, and I think the idea is to provide a broad historical overview of the U.S.-led order in East Asia in particular, and hopefully the other speakers can expand to just kind of it's specific to Northeast Asia, but hopefully other people can expand to just kind of East Asia as a whole. So just to get started, I think the United States and Japan, the two strongest mobilizers for war in the region, state that their military exercises and militarization protect the regional rules-based order. But the news rarely ever asks what this rules-based order is. So what I want to do is kind of explore what that is and what should peace movements do about it. So first, the rules-based order is not the UN-based international order. That's because the US has not actually adopted the conventions that it claims to uphold, such as the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the Permanent Court of International Justice. In fact, the US rules-based order is a system from which the US is exempt and in which the US decides which rules to enforce and against whom. As the most powerful country emerging after World War II, the US played an outsized role in creating East Asia's current status quo. In the current regional order, Japan was never held responsible for its imperialist exploitation, destruction, and killing. In fact, to quickly prop up Japan as a bulwark against communism, the CIA propped up Class A war criminals into what would become the Liberal Democratic Party, which has been in power nearly uninterrupted since 1955. Furthermore, in 1953, the US excluded Japan's greatest victims, China, Taiwan, and both Koreas, from the peace negotiations. So to understand the impact of this, we can contrast Japan's handling of its past with that of Germany. In contrast to Germany's efforts to reflect upon its past, the Japanese government still refuses to acknowledge their atrocities, including the sexual slavery of up to 200,000 women, 80 to 90% of them Korean, and overwhelmingly teenagers, its conscription of hundreds of thousands of Koreans as soldiers and labor in factories and mines, as well as countless others throughout the region. In addition, little is acknowledged of how Japan used Okinawans as human shields against invading U.S. forces and then forced them to bear the overwhelming majority of U.S. military occupation. Uh, Secondly, in this regional rules-based order, the U.S. also arbitrarily divided the Korean Peninsula. There was no cultural, historical, or social justification for the division. Furthermore, in its southern controlled area in South Korea, the U.S. squashed grassroots democratic efforts and propped up a government composed of a reviled minority of elite Japanese collaborators. After the normalization of relations between China and the US in the 1980s and the fall of the Soviet bloc in the 1990s, North Korea actively sought normalization with the US. Yet, despite these attempts, peace in the Korean Peninsula has been thwarted by US machinations for regional dominance and containment of China. In the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. intervened in the Chinese Civil War, allowing for the emergence of a separate KMT government in Taiwan that would carry out its white terror on the island for nearly 40 years, executing around 3,000 civilians and imprisoning and torturing hundreds of thousands more. So the U.S. intervention sowed the seeds of division and tension in the Taiwan Strait today. So this is a little bit of the historical background behind the current regional order. Even after the fall of the Soviet Union, the normalization of relations with China, and the attempts by North Korea to normalize relations, the U.S. has continued to maintain these divisions. As such, the old Cold War never really ended in Northeast Asia. Today, the U.S. is exploiting its bilateral military treaties across East Asia to keep the region divided and to contain China. Yet this strategy is coming up against China's growing assertiveness and confidence in the world stage. As part of its containment strategy, the U.S. pressured South Korea to forsake its claims for justice and reparations from Japan to establish the JACUS Security Cooperation Agreement, that is between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. And what this agreement does is that it reorients each of these countries' military postures from their own self-defense towards entanglement in a regional conflict, right? Their shared intelligence and anti-missile systems would be incorporated into an integrated missile defense system to neutralize China's counterattack missile capabilities. And this, in effect, puts a target upon their backs in the events of a conflict between the United States and China. And it's important to dispel the notion that advanced anti-missile defense systems can protect a country from missiles. In a contest between the two, missiles have an advantage over anti-ballistic interceptor missiles. That's because anti-missile technology is like shooting down a bullet with another more expensive bullet. It can be simply overwhelmed by shooting many more cheap bullets. And beyond carrying out joint military exercises and increasing their interoperability, JACUS also forces all three countries to consult with each other when conflict erupts. This makes it even more difficult to disentangle oneself in the case of a U.S. conflict with China over Taiwan or the South China Sea. In order to justify this aggressive posture, the U.S. uses North Korea and Taiwan as pretext. Despite the fact that North Korea has pursued a peace treaty with the U.S. since the mid-1990s, the U.S.'s broken treaties have not only made peace less likely, they have pushed North Korea towards safeguarding itself through nuclear bombs. In the Taiwan Strait, despite formally recognizing that there's only one China and that its government is in mainland China, the US continues carrying out provocations, sending high-level officials to meet with separatists, sending more weapons, and navigating US war vessels across the Taiwan Strait. In the face of such escalations, we need a regional peace movement. The first step towards this is greater solidarity and exchange like today. There has to be a greater common understanding about how US actions and policies are understood and felt by each of our movements, countries, and communities. In addition, we must move away from abstract notions of war and peace and root ourselves in history and in the concrete realities and struggles of frontline communities that are directly suffering from the increasing US militarism. At a time when the drumbeats of war are pounding louder, peace movements need to raise a common voice calling for peace. To do that, we need greater exchanges and relationship building, such as today, so that we can find common areas to struggle together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dehan, and thank you for giving us that kind of historical overview. I think you also touched on many of the regions who will speak in more detail about the impact of the US and their attempts to destabilize East Asia and other parts of the world. So next we have Corazon Fabros, who's a well-known peace activist and has dedicated much of her life to the work of nuclear disarmament, to social justice, particularly focused in the Philippines, but is a co-chair or co-president of the International Peace Bureau, as well as she convenes many other peace initiatives and peace groups and has led the campaign for peace for many decades. So Corazon, over to you.
Thank you, Mika, and thank you for the generous introduction. And we would also like to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to give our thoughts on the current issue that we are facing today. Let me begin by saying that the US bases are back in the Philippines. The establishment of foreign military bases in the Philippines has puzzled many who still are a very clear image of the hasty U.S. Exit from the Philippines in its massive military bases back in 1991 and 1992. And to think that the Philippines have now a provision against foreign military bases and troops and nuclear weapons in its constitution. Add to that, the Philippines now have many military defense agreements, not only with the United States, but also with several countries like Japan, France, Australia, UK, and under negotiations are with Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, and others that we don't know at this moment. Let me then go direct to the point. The Philippines is being groomed as the next focal point in the U.S. design. The United States design to encircle China in the Pacific and is paving the way for greater involvement of NATO allies in the region. Recently, in July 8, the Philippines and Japan, both U.S. allies, signed a reciprocal access agreement, or what I'd call RAA. This will provide for both countries' military forces to come to each other's territory for war exercise and other related purposes. It also provides, I think this is significant, it provides for Japan to sell military equipment to the Philippines to modernize its armed forces. This RAA is another link in the chain of security and defense agreements the Philippines has entered into. Just 2 months before the Japan-Philippines RAA was the US-led and baptized Squad, a regional security and defense bloc to counter China's aggressiveness in the Asia-Pacific region. The Squad is composed of the US, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. Just a month before the birth of Squad, was the US-Japan-Philippines Summit in Washington, D.C., that led to the formation of a trilateral security cooperation of the three countries. Thus, because of these, all these are provided thus in only 3 months from April. The Philippines has signed 3 strategic agreements to prepare and rehearse for war. All these are prodded by the US. Other than these, the Philippines has other defense and security pacts with the US and Australia. These are the Philippines-Australia Status of Forces Agreement back in 2007, the Philippines-Australia Comprehensive Security Partnership signed last year, the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, an old agreement that is still being used today, back in 1951, the US-Philippine Visiting Forces Agreement, or VFA, signed in 1999, and the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, signed in 2014, and affirmed for indefinite extension last February. Also being worked out since 2022 is the US-Australia-Philippines Security Triad. But though without any formal agreements yet, there has been an increasing security and defense cooperation of the three countries, as in joint naval patrols in the South China Sea, or what we'd prefer to call West Philippine Sea. Of all these agreements, the Philippines entered into the US-Philippine Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or what I'd call EDCA for short, and the increasing joint military exercises being held in the country annually, whether big or small, that are militarizing the whole archipelago and urging the Filipinos to be ready for war against US identified enemy, China. The heightened tension in the South China Sea began last year when 4 more Philippine military facilities or camps were added to the list of agreed locations, or EDCA sites for basing of US military forces, troops, weapons, and war equipment. Of the latest added EDCA sites, 3 are closest to Taiwan and 1 is within the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. These evoke, of course, strong reactions from China. There are now 9 EDCA sites, or technically US military bases in the Philippines, excluding the supposedly closed Subic Naval Base in Zambales and Clark Air Base in Pampanga, which are being actively used by US military forces, especially during war games, war exercises in the Philippines. Not among the listed EDCA sites is Camp Navarro in Zamboanga City, where 100 soldiers of the U.S. Special Forces Command are stationed on rotational basis. These U.S. military bases and the increasing joint military exercises, especially the yearly Balikatan exercises, the biggest that happens in the Philippines, which last year saw the participation as observers of 14 nations and the participation of US, France, Australia, and the host country, Philippines, that are all preparations for war against US enemies. Before Balikatan 2024, last April, the US Pacific Command deployed the mid-range capability missile system somewhere in northern Luzon, in one of the islands. Despite the end of the war exercise, the US Army has not said how long the MRC missile system will be in the Philippines. And that's very interesting and alarming as well. This is the first ever deployment of US Army's MRC seen by many as a calculated strategic move by the US to strengthen its footprint and assert its influence in the Indo-Pacific region. Russia's ambassador to the US, Anatoly Antonov, lambasted this as another step by Washington towards escalating military confrontation in the Asia-Pacific region. Such action by the US is another powerful blow to the strategic stability, the ambassador added. Of course, China's foreign ministry firmly opposed the deployment of the MRC system and urged the US to earnestly respect the security concerns of other countries. China's defense ministry called it a dangerous move that will seriously threaten the security of regional countries and undermine regional peace and security. The MRC missile system can fire the Tomahawk land attack missile, a maneuverable cruise missile with a range of 1,600 kilometers or 1,000 miles, according to the Center of Strategic and International Studies. Such range can reach China's installations and vessels in the South China Sea, in southern China mainland, and in the Taiwan Strait. These are just among the highlights of the increasing militarization of the US, of the Philippines, and the West Philippine Sea, or the South China Sea. The US has since 2010 identified China as its de facto enemy. But China is not the enemy of the Philippines, but we are being dragged by the US into this conflict with China. We see US as the real and principal warmonger and war maker since the end of World War II. It is the only country that has 800 plus military bases worldwide, and most of these are in Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region. Last month, in July 30, Blinken and Austin were in the Philippines for the first ever 2+2 ministerial dialogue with their Philippine counterpart. They affirmed their shared vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific region and discussed ways to deepen coordination on shared challenges, including in the South China Sea, and advance bilateral economic agenda. They also met with the Philippine president and explored additional ways to capitalize on the unprecedented momentum in the US-Philippines alliance. The US officials also came with $500 million military aid for the Philippines. That's the icing in the cake, I think. By all indications, the Philippines is not only being set up as one of the launch pads for US war designs. Our country is being prodded by the US to be the starter or the trigger for its war with China. I'm sorry to give you a grim picture of our situation in the Philippines. We live in an extremely dangerous times with challenges and, of course, to which we need to face in different levels. We need to create movements, people's movements, locally, regionally, and internationally, of course, to create a critical mass that aspires for peace, unity, solidarity, justice, and upholding the concept of common security, which the International Peace Bureau advocates these days. In terms of the ASEAN, the civil society movements get together every year through the ASEAN People's Forum or the ASEAN Civil Society Conference. This year, the APF will be held in Timor-Leste on September 19 to 21. Important issues such as peace, disarmament, and denuclearization, putting at the forefront the need for diplomacy, dialogue, solidarity, and the reduction of military spending to fund human needs. Let us unite against war and for peace. Let us resist U.S. war schemes and U.S. dragging the whole Asia-Pacific region into its continuing militarization in many parts of the world. Friends, we have witnessed the power of united peoples over the years. Peace and justice do not come in a silver platter, of course. Our continuing resistance as united peoples have given us victories, whether big or small. They are steps, an important steps towards achieving peace, nuclearization, and disarmament of our region. The people's resistance that continues to grow in many parts of Asia and the Pacific, in Okinawa as well as in base communities in Japan, in Jeju, Guam, in the Marianas, Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Philippines, including at the heartland of the empire, and NATO, our inspiration that continues to make us more powerful. Thank you, and let us all stay strong and committed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Corazon. How you began, although it's very sobering, I think this is a moment in history where we do need to have a very clear picture of what we're up against. And actually at Tricontinental earlier this year, we published a study called Hyper-Imperialism, a Dangerous and Decadent New Stage, where part of our intervention was that us as peace-loving people, as people involved in the peace activist movement, need to still hope, still struggle, but also have a clear sense of what we're up against. And one of those things was the fact that the US-led military bloc, the US basically garnering its forces in the global north, has at least 75%, almost 75% of military spending. And this exists in a moment in time where we could eradicate hunger, we could eradicate a lot of basic illnesses and diseases, but people still go to bed with empty stomachs whilst we have this disproportionate spending that's going towards military spending. So really appreciate what you shared. Next, we will have Max Lane, who is an Australian political analyst with Red Ant, and he specializes in Southeast Asian geopolitics. He's also written extensively on the political dynamics of Indonesia, which I think yesterday, which is today for some people in the call, was the independence anniversary of Indonesia, 17 August 1945. And so we invite you, Max, to give your inputs on the region coming from your perspective in Australia. Over to you.
Hello, everybody. It's very good to be able to speak immediately after Corazon, because I agree very much that we have to put a lot of focus on what's happening in the Philippines. I think the Philippines is a safer trigger point for the US to use than Taiwan. And I would expect that the incidents between the Philippines or the US in the Philippines and China in the oceans there will increase. But back to Australia, I'm going to talk primarily about Australia's position in all this. Way down here, as they say, down under, this weird 25 million strong, mainly white settler country, although these days at least 50% of the population has parents or themselves have been born outside of Australia. The first thing to note, as I'm sure you're all aware actually, but need to emphasize it, is that Australia is a full member of the Global Imperialist Club and has been so for 150 years. Its high GDP, its prosperity and wealth has flown directly from its integration into the Global Imperialist Club and its domination of the economic domination of the world. And Australia itself, even though quite a small economy relative to the other imperialist economies, still has big investments, in global south countries, including in Indonesia, but also as far as away in South America, in Chile. And of course, the extra thing to note here is that this high GDP per capita that Australia has not only comes from sharing in the exploitation by the imperialist bloc of the global south, it also comes from all that initial wealth accumulated as a result of the genocidal invasion initially by British colonialists that enabled the theft of the whole continent from the indigenous people of this continent. And as a consequence of its membership in this global imperialist club, in foreign policy, foreign and security policy, the Australian state and the majority of the capitalist class have always shared the same strategic interests as the imperialist bloc as a whole. And since World War II in particular, the strategic interests of the United States. In fact, prior to World War II, Australia did not even have control over its own foreign policy. In terms of how this all relates to relationship with Asia, again and again, this foreign and security policy orientation, with the Australian state seeing its interests as being the same as with the imperialist bloc as a whole, has led to, first of all, since the end of World War II, and then after the Chinese Revolution, even more so, there's always been a massive propaganda campaign amongst the Australian people about the yellow peril. The yellow peril from China, from communist China, then has often been signified on maps with China painted yellow, but a red arrow going down towards Australia via Southeast Asia. And not surprisingly, within this framework, Australian troops were involved with the US in South Korea, Malaya, Indonesia, and of course later on an even bigger scale in Vietnam. And it's important for comrades to know here that even prior to the US committing to the war in Vietnam, the Australian government was actually already urging the US to get involved. So it wasn't a matter of Australia following the US, but actually urging the US to get involved in Vietnam. So what about today? Well, Corazon also already mentioned the number of agreements that Australia has with the US, and also with the Philippines, Japan, and so on, which is integrating it into the US's aggressive policy of containment of China. Of course, the crucial one is AUKUS, the treaty or the agreement whereby Australia is going to buy nuclear-powered submarines from the United Kingdom and from the United States. And this agreement actually goes beyond just the purpose, just the buying of the submarines. It actually has a number of other aspects to it, which are all aimed at increasing the interoperability of the Australian armed forces with the US forces. Of course, there can't be complete political integration of the US and Australian armed forces, but it's getting closer and closer to that. Australia becomes a part of the whole US force projection up north towards the Chinese coast. And as far as I mentioned, Australia is also in Quad and Squad. The city of Darwin in northern Australia has been opened up to use by US forces, including planes that can possibly be carrying nuclear weapons. And of course, as you would all know, Australia has long housed very important bases for US spy satellite systems. And on a bilateral basis, there's a whole range of agreements. The Corazon mentioned with the Philippines, and there's similar agreements with Indonesia. In fact, the president-to-be, General Prabowo Subianto, will become president in Indonesia in October. He's now Minister of Defense. He'll be coming to Canberra, Australia, to sign an updating of the military agreements between security agreements between Canberra and Jakarta, I think next month or very soon. And of course, this whole signing of AUKUS, being involved in all AUKUS, Squad, opening up Darwin, etc., is all part of the reality that the Australian capitalist class shares the same understanding of the global politics in terms of the primary axis at the moment being the intensification of the global North's desire, plan, activity to increase its hegemony over the global South. It shares that outlook, whether it's on the relationship with Asia or the relationship with what's happening, for example, in Palestine. And of course, what's playing a key role in all this is the increased capacity of China to resist efforts to reinforce US hegemony. It's not at the stage where China can defeat it, but it's resisting it, and that resistance is seen as a threat, not only by the US, but by the Australian capitalist class. So as a result, in Australia now, it just rolls off the newsreader's tongue. Whenever they're talking about news, China is just referred to as an adversary. It's just become part of the mainstream of current affairs political culture. China is an adversary. And that language gets even more intense when there's discussion of what's happening in what Australian imperialists considers its own backyard, the South Pacific Islands. Then any involvement by China becomes is depicted as even more threatening when it has no military or security implications at all. Well, in the Australian case, there are contradictions for the capitalist class in this hostile attitude towards China. For Australian capital, China is crucial. Over the past 5 years, the exports of Australia to China have increased at an annualized rate of almost 8% per year, from $85 billion US dollars in 2017 to 123 billion in 2022. China almost always tops the list of countries that import goods from Australia. It's extremely important for big sections of Australian capital. And at the moment, the new Labor government that came to power last year is doing all it can to improve business ties with China, including inviting the Premier of China to come to Australia, where he was feted, state dinners, etc. And the whole aim was to open up more commercial relations, and that has improved a lot. So there's a contradiction here. At the one time, in politics, in the political sphere, anti-Chinese propaganda continues very strongly by all segments of the capitalist class. With the occasional dissent. Probably the most well-known source of dissent is from the former Labor Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who's been a very assertive critic of AUKUS, and also being seen as outside the mainstream way of looking at things by insisting that Taiwan belongs to China. Taiwan is Chinese real estate. That's his term. Stop agitating around the Taiwan question, he says. Now that's dissent, a little bit of dissent, one person really from within the Australian political elite. But what about outright opposition to these policies? I think basically the outright opposition only comes from elements in the Australian left. And you can perhaps see two major streams. I'm simplifying here things just to squeeze it in, but you can see two mainstreams. One is a kind of moderate left, or left of centre, or some people would even say centrist party or Liberal Democratic Party or whatever, which is the Greens Party in Australia, which has some members of in the Senate and a couple of members in the House of Representatives, or one member, I think, a couple of members in the House of Representatives. It completely opposes AUKUS, this AUKUS treaty, but in its propaganda and education and explanation, its emphasis is on that it's a waste of money to buy nuclear submarines, that erodes Australia's defence sovereignty, handing it over to the US, and also talks about the environmental impacts of storage of nuclear waste from such submarines. It does publish some statements on China, stating that China is not a threat and arguing for more cooperation, but it's not something it stresses in its major statements or campaigns. It's more on the waste of money aspect and the erosion of defence sovereignty. And also the Green Party does not initiate or lead mass campaigns or protests. It's strictly an electoral or parliamentary body. The other stream relates to the peace movement and the socialist left or the far left. There is an anti-AUKUS coalition in Australia, and there is an independent and peaceful Australia network. They're both very active, but they are small and very weak, with very minimal public profile or impact. This is a result of the fact that there's been a 20-year decline of the radical left in Australia, especially a decline of those groups whose political perspective is based on seeing the main contradiction in global politics now between that being the global north versus the global south, that is imperialism. Groups on the left that really emphasize that and have that as their starting point are very, very, very weak. And also, perhaps connected to this smallness and weakness, is that one of the statements put out by the peace movement groups in Australia also tends to emphasise the waste of money, the erosion of defence sovereignty. There's anybody really who campaigns emphasising, the main point: China is simply not an enemy, or something similar to that. Nor does it educate on seeing the US containment of China today as linked to the general global north versus global south dynamic that's central today. I just want to end by making one point, which I think is very important. Australia Australia is a country which is fully integrated into the imperialist camp. I think it would be great benefit to the movement in the region as a whole if this small imperialist country that plays a very high profile, if not doesn't have a big military role, but I think it has a high political profile role in the US plans. I think there is potential for what is a weak and small movement now to grow. Part of this just means more hard work by the activists building the movement, especially the new young people coming into the movement. Just the hard work of patiently explaining and helping build actions when that opportunity arises. But one thing that would help, and I just echoing what Corazon also said, I think in the Australian context, if we can increase the voices of the people movements of Asia in Australia itself, I think that would actually give a big boost to the movement here. At the moment, we've become isolated from hearing what progressive people in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, and Northeast Asia, what they think and say. Almost no presence. If we can boost that, I think that would be a big help. One of the groups I'm involved in, Red Ant, but I'm also a senior fellow at Tricontinental Institute too. One of the things we're doing is organising a speaking tour to 4 Australian cities for the Tricontinental director, Vijay Prasad, in October, November. But I think it'd be great if there were more visits to Australia by Asian friends to educate people here about the situation, the destabilizing effect of the US in the Asian region, and how that fits into the overall imperialist political situation that we face today. It might be hard to do that in terms of resources and infrastructure and so on, because the movements are small, the groups here are small and weak. But I think it is urgent, and it would be really very useful to hear Asian voices more strongly reflected in Australia. I'll finish there.
I think these overlap with the Mandarin translation right now in the English channel. Sorry, Max, could you repeat your line?
I was just ending saying that it will be a very big boost to help grow this small movement and groups in Australia if we can hear, if more friends from Asia were able to come to Australia, so that your voices can be heard amongst the Australian people. At the moment, there's almost none of that.
Fully agreed. Thank you so much, Max. I think important contributions there, and also echoing, as you said, with Corazon, that we need to find ways in which we can increase exchange amongst people in the region. I just want to again highlight that Corazon mentioned that in September there will be the Asian Peoples Forum, which I think we will definitely be sharing and retweeting and ensuring that we have more people participating in that, whether in person or online. And that agreed, we need to find out ways with our limited resources to get our people to talk to one another, because unfortunately we know the huge arsenal of media apparatus and infrastructure that the US and Western aligned organizations continue to totally dominate the conversation, and we need to find our alternatives. And I mean, if it was possible for revolutions to be led in primitive Russia in 1917, I think with all the resources we have in terms of communication tools, we can figure out a way. So thank you so much, Max. Next, we have Jixing Tang, who's a member of the Labour Party Taiwan China, and he'll be speaking in Korean, so just make sure you're in the correct channel. Over to you, Jixing. If you can unmute, just a reminder to unmute yourself, Jixing.
음성 소리 해제해야 될 것 같아요.
예, 들리나요?
Can you hear me?
예, 들리나요? 예.
네.
이렇게 중요한 회의를
Thank you for inviting me
위한 그 의미
to this
깊은 회의를
important and
마련해
meaningful
주셔서
webinar.
너무 감사합니다. 미국이 시작하겠습니다.
I'll start.
미국이 중국을 봉쇄하는 큰 전략
Under the grand strategy of the US to contain China, in 2018, Trump launched a trade war and a technology war against China. He used Taiwan as an anti-China pawn to provoke China politically. And
그 뒤에 이은
Biden administration strengthened the military blockade in cooperation with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines, creating the current tense situation and Cold War atmosphere in East Asia.
이러한 기본적인 상황 속에서
Under these basic circumstances, today, I'd like to talk to you about the internal situation in Taiwan under the rule of the DPP, a pro-US separatist party, and the tense relations across the Taiwan Strait.
많은 해외 친구들이 동지들이
Many of
대만의
my comrades abroad
분리주의에
have a
분리주의 세력의
misunderstanding
인식에
of the
잘못
DPP,
이해하는
a
부분이
separatist
있어서
party in Taiwan.
간단하게
So I
대만의
will briefly
분리주의에
explain
대해서
the history of
설명드리고자
Taiwanese
합니다.
separatism. In 1895,
중국을 침략하여
Japan
대만을
invaded
식민지로
China and seized
강전하였습니다.
Taiwan as a
그리고
colony.
50년 후 1945년
In
중국이
1945,
항일 전쟁에서
China won the
승리하면서
anti-Japanese war,
대만은 조국의 품으로
and
돌아올
Taiwan
수
was able to
있었습니다.
return to the motherland.
대만 내의 친일파들은 당연히
Naturally,
대만의
pro-Japanese factions in Taiwan opposed the return,
분리주의의
and
기원이
this is where
되었습니다.
separatism originated.
1952년
In
미국 주도하에
1952,
일방적으로
the US-led
샌프란시스코
unilateral
조약이
San Francisco Treaty
체결되었습니다.
was signed,
당시
which
미국은 중국과
deliberately
소련의
violated
사회주의 진영을
the
봉쇄하기 위해
Potsdam and Cairo
논리적으로
declarations
포츠담
in order
선언과
to
카이로
contain the
선언을
socialist
위반하여
camps of China
대만의
and the
주의를
Soviet Union,
불확정 상태로
leaving Taiwan's
만들었고
status
대만
indeterminate,
분리주의자들은 이를
which
자신의 이른바
Taiwanese separatists
국제적
used as their
법적
so-called
근거로 삼았습니다.
international legal basis.
쉽게 말해서 대만의 분리주의는
In short,
제국주의에 의해
Taiwan
만들어진
separatism
것입니다.
was created by imperialism. Of
그
course,
이후에도
later,
토지 개혁으로 땅을 빼앗긴
landowners
지주들과
displaced by land
냉전 체제
reform,
하에서 만들어진 방공주의자
anti-communist created
그리고
under
대만
the Cold
북의
War,
특유의
and
지역주의자들이
Taiwan's unique
합류하여
regionalists
현재의
joined together
분리주의
to
세력을
form the current
형성했습니다.
separatist forces.
2016년 민진당 집권 후
After the DPP
하나의
came to
중국
power
원칙을
in
부정하기
2016,
시작했습니다.
it began to
하나의
repudiate
중국
the One
원칙은
China
원래
principle,
양안 관계에
which
평화적
was
교류를
originally
유지하는
the most
가장 근본적인
fundamental
정치적
political basis
기반이었습니다.
for maintaining peaceful exchanges
이
and
기반이
cross-strait
무너지자
relations.
중국 대륙은 대만과의 공식적인
With this
교류를
foundation
단절할 수밖에
crumbling,
없었습니다.
mainland China had no choice
그러나
but to
중국
cut
대륙은
off
인간
official
교류를
exchanges with Taiwan.
유지하기를 희망했습니다.
However, mainland China hoped to maintain
왜냐하면
civilian exchanges because
중국 대륙은 교류
it believes
강화를 통해
that through strengthening exchanges,
미래 통일에 유리한
they
조건을
can
만들 수 있다고
understand each other
때문입니다.
and create favorable conditions for future
그러나
reunification.
민진당은 반대로
The DPP, on the other hand,
냉전 체제로 돌아가기를
wanted to return to the
원했습니다.
old Cold War system,
특히 외부의
especially
적을 만들어내는 것이
since creating an external enemy was very
매우
beneficial to the
유리했습니다.
DPP's electoral prospects.
따라서 민진당은 각종
As a result,
민간 교류를 방해하고
the DPP has disrupted and even
협박까지
intimidated various civilian exchanges.
먼저
First,
민진당은 국가보안법,
the DPP
등 법률을
amended
개정하여
laws such
민중의
as the
자유를
National Security Law
억압하고
Act
중국 대륙과의
to suppress
교류를
people's freedom
제한했습니다.
and restrict exchanges with
그리고 또
mainland China.
반침투법을
Then,
새로 제정하여
It enacted a
양안
new
평화를
anti-infiltration
바라는
law
사람들을 적과
accusing
내통하는
those
것으로
who wanted
몰아갔습니다.
peace across the Taiwan Strait of colluding with the
그리고
enemy.
민진당은 미국의 지시에 따라
Then it
징병제를
extended conscription from 4 months
1년으로
to 1 year
연장했습니다.
at the behest of the
군사
US.
예산은 최근
The military
5년 동안
budget has doubled in the last
증가하였습니다.
5 years,
GDP의
reaching 2.5% of GDP
앞으로도
and is expected to increase significantly in the future.
전쟁 준비에 있어
In preparing for war, the U.S. has instructed the military to prepare for war of attrition within the island of Taiwan, a military strategy that has made every citizen face the saturation of war. The front of the house will soon become the battlefield. However, from the U.S. perspective, it is the most exhausting way of warfare for the Chinese mainland. That is why the U.S. prefers this strategy. Newly inaugurated on May 20, 2024, Lai Ching-te is known for his harder separatist stance than his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen. In his inaugural speech, Lai Ching-te clearly asserted his separatist stance and provoked mainland China. And 3 days later, on May 23rd, the China held a military exercise to encircle the island of Taiwan in a full state of war. Lai Ching-te's hardline stance has even the U.S. worried that it could break free from U.S. control and take drastic action. We believe that the immediate task of the cross-strait peace force and reunification movement is to oppose separatism and foreign intervention. We believe that as long as foreign powers do not intervene and support separatism, Chinese people on both sides of the strait can surely resolve the cross-strait issue peacefully and further promote peace in East Asia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yusing Tong. I think a very important intervention, particularly because of the confusion that exists around the pro-US/US supported and created Taiwanese separatists. So appreciate that, and particularly chilling, and I think something that people should take cognizance is what you said, our homes would become the battlefields. This isn't a big man thing above us. This is how our homes will become battlefields. And that's, I think, an important message to share to people who aren't necessarily thinking about the bigger geopolitical struggles, but our homes would become battlefields. So appreciate your intervention. Next, we have 3 more speakers that I'm very excited for their different interventions. And next we will have Hideki Yoshikawa, who is an environmental activist and a director at the Okinawa Environmental Justice Network. He has been a leading voice in the campaign against US military bases and militarism, particularly around the environmental and social impact, which, for those who don't know, the US military is the largest single institutional carbon emissions emitter. And so to call for demilitarization is not simply to say we don't want to fight, it's also to think about how do we protect the limited resources we have on Earth that are already in huge disarray and disproportionately affect people who have nothing to do with these bigger struggles, whether it's small countries, Pacific Islanders, the East African coast. Those are the ones who are seeing the negative impacts of this increased carbon emissions that is directly tied to military spending. So thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Right. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mika, for kind words. Right. My name is Hideki Yoshikawa, and I am the director of Okinawa Environmental Justice Project. Our project aims to address and solve the issues related to U.S. military bases in Okinawa, Japan, from an environmental perspective. Today, I have 3 points to make. The first point, the overwhelming presence of the U.S. military in Okinawa has posed a significant threats to our daily lives and the environment. During World War II, Okinawa was a fierce ground battle site. more than 200,000 lives perished. That's including 1 in 4 Okinawans. The war also caused significant environmental distractions. After the war, the US military took over people's land and converted them into their military bases. And Okinawa was placed under the US military occupations until 1972, the year that Okinawa was returned to Japan. Today, although the Okinawa comprises less than 1% of the Japan's landmass, it hosts 90% of the US military bases in Japan. Our land and the water have been contaminated with the chemicals such as PFAS from the US military bases. People suffer from the deafening noise of the US military aircraft flying overhead. We live in fear of falling objects from aircrafts and aircraft crashes. Our land and sea have been further damaged by the constructions of our new military base and facilities. And despite our repeated demand for the reduction of the US military presence in Okinawa, our democratic voices have been ignored by the Japanese and the US governments. So from our perspective on the ground, it is just clear the US military has been destabilizing Okinawa for the last 79 years. Now, the second point. As the US and Japanese governments are propagating these China threats and the Taiwan contingency narratives, Okinawa and many parts of mainland Japan have been further militarized. Now this involves not only the US military, but the Japanese self-defense forces. That's what the Japanese government called the Nansei shift. Southwest shift is rapidly taking place. For example, in Yonaguni and Miyako and Yaeyama Islands, that's the outer islands of Okinawa Prefecture located close to Taiwan and China. In these islands, bases for the Japanese self-defense forces have been built, and the surface-to-ship missile systems have been deployed or are planned to be deployed. And recently, the US military set up a radar system on Yonaguni Islands to monitor Chinese military movements. And also the joint military exercise such as the Resolute Dragon involving the US Marines and the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force have taken place in Okinawa and Kyushu and other parts of Japan. And they all focus on this countering China's aggressive maritime expansions. It is important to emphasize that this military cooperation between Japan and the US has developed over the last 15 years in response to China's growing economic power and military power. And it has fundamentally reshaped Japan's long-held post-war stance on peace. With Obama's administration advocating its pivot to Asia in 2014, then the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's cabinet and the National Diet allowed the reinterpretation of Japan's post-war peace constitution. Now, when an armed attack against Japan's ally, this case the US, occurs, and as a result, it threatens Japan's survival, Japan can use forces against the adversary in names of the collective self-defense. And 2 years ago, 2022, under the present Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, Japanese Ministry of Defense identified China as the greatest strategic challenge. And Kishida also announced that Japan would increase military spending up to 2% of GDP by 2027, abandoning the 1% cap that have been held in place since 1976. The way the Japanese government has militarized these outer islands of Okinawa and how local people are now reacting to this is very revealing. Japanese government proposed the deployments of self-defense forces and the missile defense systems to those islands as a means of self-defense, of course. And the local governments accepted them as a means of economic revitalizations and a boost to population growth. However, the true nature of these militarizations has become more and more apparent recently. Earlier this month, Japanese government held a meeting with the local residents on Ishigaki Island to explain its evacuation plans in case of conflict with other nations. So it's implying China. Locals were surprised to realize that their islands could be actually targeted and that they might have to evacuate. At the same time, these evacuation plans have led many to believe that China's threats is real and the Taiwan contingency is highly likely. Now, the final point. Just like many other countries, local people in Okinawa have been holding meetings and rallies against these further militarizations. And we have also established networks with the anti-militarization movements in mainland Japan, which is very encouraging. To be honest, however, we feel overwhelmed and overstretched. We understand that our struggle must continue even as a symbolic act, but we also realize we must seek effective ways to stop this further militarization. One framework we are examining in our efforts is the 1978 Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Japan and China. This bilateral framework, treaty, forbid Japan or China from treating the other as an enemy. It requires both countries to develop relations of perpetual peace and friendship and a peaceful coexistence. It requires Japan and China to settle dispute peacefully and refrain from using force or threats of force. It also declares that neither country should seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region or in any other regions. It also declares that each opposes efforts by any other country or a group of countries to establish such hegemony. I hope we in Okinawa and Japan can utilize this treaty to counter the US and Japanese governments' narrative of the China threats and the Taiwan contingency. I also hope the international civil societies in South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Hawaii, and Australia and pay attention to this bilateral treaty between China and Japan in their struggle against this destabilizing military force by the US. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know that often in these moments when we have to self-reflect on the challenges we're faced with and the work that still needs to be done, it can be quite overwhelming, but I'm highly encouraged just by having all of you who are joining us today. And we know that you guys all represent many, many other people who are active and committed to finding ways to peace and a people's-led peace that's centered in our daily lives, and the importance of making those collaborations known, I think, is part of the work No Cold War wants to continue to push and for all of us to continue to be involved in. So thank you so much for the intervention. Again, as sobering as it is, I still feel quite a bit of twinkle of hope just by seeing all of your faces here together. So next we have Shin Jaek, who is a researcher at the Civilian Military Watch, and he's mainly focused on analyzing and educating people in South Korea around the South Korean military policy and its posture and how it impacts the US's geopolitical designs in the region. So over to you.
Hi, my name is Shin Jae-wook. Thanks for inviting this forum. I'm going to talk about the implication of an enhanced Indo-Pacific strategy for South Korea, focusing on the revitalization of the UN mission and the US-Japan-Korea military alliance that the US is pushing for. On August 2nd, Germany became the 18th member of the
Yes.
the 18th member of the United Nations Command. The Moon Jae-in administration had opposed, but it was completed under Yoon Suk-yeol administration. At the ceremony, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius talked about what it means to be a member of UNC. It is a symbol of our shared commitment to a rule-based international order that respects the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity, just like Tae Han-sung mentioned, and said our decision to join UNC demonstrates our strong belief that the security of Europe is closely linked to the security of the Indo-Pacific. The UNC was established by UN Security Council Resolution 84 in 1950, following the outbreak of the Korean War. Its current mandate is to maintain the armistice and provide military power to the Korean Peninsula in case of an emergency. Since the early 2000s, however, the U.S. has sought to transform the UNC into a U.S.-centric multinational force through the UNC revitalization, an effort to use it as a force for its Indo-Pacific strategy in East Asia. While there is some debate about whether the legal basis of UNC remains, the reality is that it can't but continue if the US wants it to continue. While South Korea's Yoon Suk-yeol government cites UNC only as a deterrent to North Korea, as the German defense minister said earlier, intends to use UNC as a centerpiece of its Indo-Pacific strategy and the rule-based order. Today, as the U.S. struggled to pay for security abroad on its own budget, UNC is well positioned to mobilize multinational forces. Already, UNC members such as the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand are in East Asia around the freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. However, they are using the enforcement of sanctions against North Korea as a pretext for their presence in the region and are already using UNC's rear bases in Japan as staging areas. At the same time, these countries are also engaged in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea as part of their participation in the Indo-Pacific strategy. In that sense, Germany's membership in the UNC guarantees an institutional channel for Germany, a key NATO member, to engage in an Indo-Pacific strategy as South Korea strengthens its cooperation with NATO as a part of NATO Asia-Pacific Partnership, along with Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. The Yoon Suk-yeol administration speaks about the deterrent power of the UNC. However, the problem is that in case of Taiwan contingency, South Korea risks being implicated. Yoon's government has also officially stated that it is committed to the Indo-Pacific strategy. This is, of course, in line with the U.S. intentions. In early November 2023, the defense minister of UNC member states met together for the first time since the Korean War. Meanwhile, the current commander of U.S. forces in Korea formalized during his confirmation hearings that U.S. forces would participate in the event of a Taiwan-like situation. This means that South Korea could very well be involved. Next, I'll talk about the institutionalization of the US, Japan, South Korea military alliances.
강화하고 제도화시키는지 그거를 이제 없애버리지 못하도록 좀 공고화하는지에 대해서 좀 말씀드리겠습니다.
In July, two documents were adopted that will have a very significant impact on South Korea's security. The Memorandum of Cooperation on Trilateral Security Cooperation Framework, adopted by the defense minister of the three countries in Tokyo. This is the first security-related cooperation memorandum signed by the military authorities of the three countries. Experts view that it has basically consolidated the trilateral military alliance. The TSCF includes the aforementioned regularization of trilateral joint exercises, high-level policy consultation, information sharing, and defense exchanges and cooperation. The memorandum is a follow-up to the Camp David Declaration, which was agreed to by leaders of three countries in August 2023 and focuses on the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. It is an important document that could provoke strong reactions from countries that the alliances views as enemies, China, Russia, North Korea, but in South Korea, it has neither been approved by the National Assembly nor its full text been revealed. It's understood that standard operating procedure have been fully worked out. In fact, in June, the UK ROK multi-domain exercise, Freedom Edge, was held. While the military has previously practiced in limited areas such as search and rescue, missile warning, and escorting strategic bombers, this is the first time a comprehensive multidisciplinary exercise has been held, including sea, underwater, air, and cyber. The exercise took place in Jeju Naval Base. Ever since the construction of the Jeju Naval Base, it was suspected that it would be used as an outpost against China. This is stating to be realized. The second document is the guideline for nuclear operation for nuclear deterrence on the Korean Peninsula. This was accomplished by Yoon's government's insistence on extended deterrence, which was also a great benefit to the U.S. The guideline called for U.S. nuclear operation on the Korean Peninsula to be supported by South Korean conventional forces. This inevitably entails South Korean subordination, as it means building South Korea's military capabilities to support U.S. nuclear deterrence and nuclear operations. The centrality of the U.S. in the ROK-U.S. alliance is further reinforced. Extended deterrence is of course intended for North Korea, but the problem with this is that when a U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile flies to Pyongyang, much of its flight path is not much different from that of a U.S. ICBM targeting Beijing, China. In reality, U.S. nuclear operations include not only North Korea, but also nuclear threats from China and Russia. In this case, the U.S. would be defending U.S. strategic assets with South Korea's conventional weapons without any additional obligations, while the U.S. would be practicing nuclear operations under the Indo-Pacific strategy. Shortly after the guidelines were adopted, the first combined nuclear conventional tabletop exercise between the U.S. and South Korean military authorities was held in August at Camp Humphreys in Pyeongtaek, under the scenario of a North Korean nuclear attack. South Korean security expert Moon Jang-yeol assessed the two documents as followed. The ROK-U.S. nuclear guidelines, which institutionalized the trilateral military alliance, and the ROK-U.S.-Japan framework, which integrates the three countries through three integration. The ROK-U.S. nuclear and conventional integration, the Self-Defense Forces Unified Operation Command, which will be launched next year, the USFK's Unified Military Command, which will be established accordingly.
한반도 지금
Lastly,
이런
I'll talk about the dangers facing people in South Korea.
피해 주민들이 어떤 피해를 위험에 노출되는지를 좀
In what is
말씀드리려고 합니다.
considered the West Coast
그래서
war belt,
저희는 소위
which includes Sosangri village in Cheongju,
평택,
where THAAD is
군산,
deployed,
이 공군기지가
Pyeongtaek with Camp Humphreys,
제주 해군기지,
군산
제주 한국 기지지만 미국이 이제 사용할 수
with
있습니다.
Kunsan U.S. Air Base, and Jeju with the Jeju Naval Base,
이제 땅도 빼앗기고
which is a Korean base but can be used by the U.S. at any time. These people have had land taken away and are vulnerable to U.S. military crimes, crashes by aircraft such as in Pyeongtaek, noise pollution, and environmental damage like in Okinawa. All of these has been marginalized and has gone largely unnoticed. This is not well known among the general population and is not known by other people than those living there.
그래서 이 모든 게 사실 일반 시민들에게 잘
Another point to consider is why cooperation between South Korea and Japan has not been successful in the past. The biggest obstacle to the military alliance between South Korea and Japan has been the historical issue between the two countries. In fact, the Korean-Japanese past history problem is the same as the US-Japan-Korea past history problem. The San Francisco system was established by absorbing Imperial Japan of some of its past responsibility. Against this backdrop, Japan tried to regain its status as a war-capable state by denying the existence of the problems caused by its hegemonic imperialist colonization. Without any reflection on this situation, the Yoon Suk-yeol government has acted as if it were a spokesperson for Japanese government, disregarding the victims of Japanese imperialism. The history of imperialism's victimization is also one of the great danger of the US-Japan military alliances. Thank you.
군사동맹 강화가 불러온 위험이라고 할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 네, 이상으로 발제 마치겠습니다. 네, 감사합니다.
Thank you so much. I think, again, an important intervention to be made. For those who don't know, and we discovered this in our hyper-imperialism study, the Republic of Korea has 62 military bases and has the third largest installment in terms of a country or territory of foreign military bases after Germany and Japan. And this is not including, as Corazon mentioned, that there are a lot of different forms of a military base that are a base in all but name. So the military presence of the US often escapes us because of all these unofficial, non-permanent bases or lily pads and various forms of occupations that aren't counted or listed as military bases. And speaking of occupations, our next speaker, who's hailing from Hawaii, is I'm going to try my best, Kavena. I really think that it's important to learn to pronounce everyone's names. But we have Kavena Ulaokala Kapahua, who is from Hawaii and is a member of Hoi Aloha Aina, which is an organization dedicated to the restoration and the pursuit of Hawaiian sovereignty and indigenous rights. And I think it's particularly important he will be our last speaker for today, is because, for those who don't know, in June, we had the Rim of the Pacific exercises, which has been held every year since 1971. And this year it was held in Hawaii, in that territory that continues to be illegally occupied by the United States. And of course, I think it's a very poignant example of the importance of trying to connect ourselves across the region, and how one region's occupation is at the detriment of the rest of the world, because we saw the participation, quite strange in my opinion, of many countries who have no rim on the Pacific, including the Zionist state of Israel, who's been continuing their genocide of the Palestinian people. And so to allow for the occupation or continued occupation of Hawaii and the military exercises that are involved in the Pacific in its pursuit of containing China and undermining other regional forces that are fighting for peace is also a part of our fight to see this as a bigger picture that needs all of us to be involved, because as we say, and I've grown up in South Africa, and my political work has been mostly in the trade union circles. And one of the sayings we say is an injury to one really is an injury to all. So we end with you, Kavena. So over to you.
Mahalo. Thank you for that introduction. Again, thank you everyone for having me here. I'm Kavena Ulo Kala Kapahua. I'm with Hui Alohaina. We're one of the original Hawaiian independence parties that was founded in 1893 after the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom by the U.S. military. Just to kind of frame our history for people who may not be as familiar with it, I want to start today by taking us back to the beginning of U.S. imperialism in Hawaii. And, you know, the U.S. has continuously over the last few decades and even century tried to use Hawaii as the next stage or as the gateway of it in its manifest destiny. Yeah. And this all started in 1873 when the U.S. sent General John Schofield on a secret mission here to scout out a new base for the U.S. military in the Pacific with the express goal of using that as a stopping over station to reach China. And then, you know, soon after with the opening of Japan and amongst other things, the beginning of U.S. imperialism in Asia. And so this has really culminated in the perfect storm of U.S. imperialism in the Pacific. You know, after the designation of Hawaii as the prime candidate for a U.S. military base, they overthrew our government in support of a cabal of sugar barons and other capitalist elites and established Pearl Harbor Naval Station, which is today the command station of the Pacific Fleet. Hawaii is one of the most militarized places in the world. Now, we host unwillingly over 12 major military installations, including, but not limited to, the headquarters of the Indo-Pacific Command, which is the largest command in the United States military, the largest training facility in the Pacific, Pohakuloa Training Facility. We host the Pacific Fleet, which is, again, the largest naval fleet that the United States has, and missile defense stations like the Barking Sands Missile Range on Kauai, as well as numerous radar tracking sites, as the U.S. continues its pivot to Asia. But that also means in that pivot to Asia that started under Barack Obama, that in order to reach Asia, the U.S. must also pivot to the Pacific. And so, you know, the European empires, ever since Magellan came through our territory in a very accidental manner, the European empires have always viewed the Pacific as a playground and as a conquest. The U.S. in its pivot now is trying to entirely restructure its fighting force in order to function within this vast expanse that is the Pacific Ocean. You know, the U.S. has always treated the Pacific as an American lake, right? They have Guam on one end, they have California on the other, American Samoa to the south, along with Australia and New Zealand, as was mentioned earlier, and the Five Eyes. And the military that it built in the early 90s and just before that to oppress the Middle East is now realizing it's woefully under-equipped to confront the realities of an oceanic conflict as it tries to stir up conflict with China. We have a very large Marine Corps base here called Kaneohe Marine Corps Base, which was established upon land that it evicted entire towns from. They're having to restructure the Marine Corps by getting rid of all of their tanks, because there's no point in having tanks on Pacific Islands because there's not a lot of room for them to go and it's very rough terrain. So they have to get rid of their tanks and restructuring as an island hopping amphibious assault force. They're deploying Predator assassin drones, which are renowned in the Middle East, of course, for their drone strikes. They're basing them here, despite the fact they have a range under 1,000 miles, which means they're basically useless for pan-Pacific travel or for inter-island travel. All to say is that, you know, as the U.S. continues to beat the drums of war with Asia, it's woefully underprepared for it, but it's rushing toward it in an effort to sustain its military dominance and its imperialist dominance, and to fund its military industrial addiction. One such way that I think Mika did a great job of mentioning earlier is the Rim of the Pacific exercises, or RIMPAC, which just wrapped up at the beginning of this month. These are war games that are held every 2 years. They've been going on since the 1970s, and our movement has continued to fight them every time because they're built upon stolen land, as I mentioned before. You know, they take place on U.S. military bases and are engaged in massively destructive conduct. What was mentioned earlier about the U.S. being the largest institutional polluter on the planet, we know it here far too well. The U.S. has destroyed entire islands through its bombing in the Pacific, not just through nuclear, test, but also in Hawaii, the island of Ko'olawe was destroyed, or it had its water table broken, meaning that it no longer can sustain fresh water due to U.S. military bombing, which was part of the RIMPAC games back in the 70s. These games include over 26 countries, 25,000 troops, dozens of surface vessels, submarines, aircraft, and amphibious fighting forces. And generally, they have been used in the past several years, especially as a way of saber rattling against China. And also to train allied nations in strategies to be employed against the United States enemies, be they state or non-state actors. And these scenarios that they train foreign nations and their own troops is significantly important, I think, particularly to this group, because it's so well represented that our people tend to be the battlefields that these exercises are focusing on. You know, Okinawa and Hawaii have a very similar history, unfortunately, of the U.S. using us and polluting us. Korea was mentioned earlier as well. You know, in the 2022 RIMPAC games, North Korea was the unofficial pretend opposition force during RIMPAC. They, you know, the U.S. denied that, of course, but then, you know, in footage, you can see Kim Jong-un's portrait in every single one of the houses that the U.S. military trained their units to clear. And then even before that, the participants practiced a counterinsurgency strategy against the Pacific Island insurgency movement. So they're preparing not just for a war in Asia, but preparing to confront indigenous uprisings here in the Pacific, like we're seeing in New Caledonia, or Kanaki now, that France is currently engaged in and is still ongoing. And I encourage everyone to continue to pay attention, because there are still ongoing uprisings there. The U.S. has used RIMPAC to train a who's who of global oppressors, colonizers, oppressive and genocidal regimes, as was mentioned earlier, not just the U.S., but Canada, Israel, Indonesia, and unfortunately, even nations that have condemned Israel and have broken ties with them, such as Colombia and other Latin American nations, continue to partake in these things, even though, again, some of these nations, like Israel or other states like Brazil, have no Pacific border, but are still partaking in these games. And all of this, of course, again, taking place on stolen land. And our sacred places are massively impacted by this. Makua Valley is one of the most sacred places in the Hawaiian Islands. It's been used as a bombing range since World War II. Pohakuloa on the Big Island is over 100,000 acres of land. And it's the premier training facility in the entire Pacific. They've done everything from airstrikes there to troop movements to using depleted uranium rounds. And, you know, these impacts are incredibly violent to our people. Not, you know, depleted uranium is not great for anybody's health, particularly if it's left up uncleaned. And there's great documentation of this, of, you know, the U.S. does its bombings, it contaminates the area, and then leaves it, doesn't clean any of it up. So the next time they airstrike the area, it gets knocked up in all the dust. But this isn't, you know, and it's not just these kind of live fire exercises that continue to contaminate our areas, our land. Red Hill is one that's come up in the last several years. The U.S. used to have its premier fueling station here in Hawaii called the Red Hill Strategic Oil Reserve. It was basically an underground bunker full of oil tanks that held over 280 million gallons of fuel, and has been broken since they built it in World War II. And has continuously been leaking fuel since then. Over 200,000 gallons has now gone into our drinking water, and in 2021 poisoned 93,000 people. I hate to tell you this, but they're still poisoning us, even though after months of sustained protests, we got the U.S. military to shut down the facility. They started cleaning it up, and we, of course, similar to Okinawa, have been met with the horrible realities of PFAS, the forever chemical that is now in our drinking water. And, you know, the U.S. has not fully cleaned up our water, no matter what they say. They continue to try to make light of it, make it like it's over. But just earlier this past week, it came to light that the fuel that leaked out of the facility has now moved in the underground aquifer to a new region and is now contaminating the water of a new region of the island. So it's an unfolding event. And I think also very indicative of where our future is headed, not just in Hawaii, but globally, as the U.S. continues to engage in these very short-sighted, detrimental, problematic practices. And in addition to this, we need to think about the impact the U.S. is having in the Pacific as a point of struggle, right? The Pacific Islands pose no threat to anybody, except when they are utilized as military targets by the United States. The U.S. No one has an interest in taking over Hawaii except for America, and now because of that, similar to Guam has a lot of concerns about this. In a peer-to-peer war or internation war, our islands unfortunately have become prime targets for other militaries because of the threat they pose to them. And this is the only time you'll hear me give credit to John, a liberal, but basically John Oliver put out on Last Week Tonight, put out a great show last week that I think everyone should go watch. It's focused on Hawaii. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it focused on a really key issue that I want to bring to everyone's attention today, because I think this is going to be a defining issue for all of our movements, not just in Hawaii, not just in the US, but in Asia for the next decade. In 2029, 40,000 acres of US military land that was stolen by the US military just after World War II and has been leased to the US military for $1 for 65 years, 40,000 acres, it's going to expire. And this land the lease for this has never expired before. This is the first time. And of course, this doesn't mean that only when leases expire we can get land back, but it offers us a time to intervene on this process that's critically important, not just to Hawaii, but to Okinawa, to the Philippines, to China, to Korea, because so many of the premier military facilities in the Pacific under the Indo-Pacific Command are in this. Ho'akuloa, the main training facility in the Pacific. There is no other place in the Pacific that the U.S. can train as many troops in as extreme conditions as they can at Ho'akuloa. That is up for renewal. That is up for lease. The Barking Sands Missile Range, one of the most state-of-the-art missile facilities the U.S. has in the Pacific region, that is also up for lease renewal. Makua Valley, again, a civilian town that was turned into a bombing range post-World War II, also up for renewal, including some of the U.S.'s premier jungle warfare training facilities on the island of Oahu and other radar tracking stations. All of these are crucially important to their strategies. And I want to bring them to everyone's attention so that, globally, our movements for peace can be aware of this, because it's so rare for us to have opportunities to confront imperialism in this way, to have opportunities to not just, combat the wars that the U.S. continuously engages in, but to weaken them, to take away their ability to conduct such atrocities, to conduct such crimes against humanity. And be aware that these are coming down the pipeline. How often do we have a chance to plan 5 years ahead? Right? We so often are forced to confront things as they happen. The U.S. commits an atrocity. It does something. We have to react to it. Now we are gifted with an opportunity to plan, to strategize, to build coalition, to build with each other, to remove these from the card deck that the U.S. has in its hand, and remove their ability to put these in other places, because some of these are just irreplaceable for them. And win or lose, this will define probably the next decade of U.S. imperialism as the U.S. continues to move toward conflict with China and with the rest of Asia. These bases that are built on evicted communities, built on sacred cultural sites, built on incredibly critical environmental regions, Superfund sites. It is not just a win for the Hawaiian movement for us to get some of our land back, woohoo, even though it's probably incredibly contaminated, but also because that's one less time the IDF can train on how to drop bombs on Palestinian homes. It's one less time that the U.S. can test intercontinental ballistic missiles that would have the capability of reaching China or Korea. It's one less place that the U.S. can store its forces that will not absolutely in no way fit in any other Pacific island, be they Okinawa or Guam or anywhere else. It's one less place they can host a fleet the size they do at Pearl Harbor, because there's no other harbor large enough in the Pacific for them to host such a size of a force. And it's an opportunity for us as Hawaiians to not just return our people to their homes, which they've been denied for over 65 years and prior to that, but also a chance for our people to return to their farmlands, to make ourselves self-sustainable again, because the U.S. military has destroyed much of our farmland and we now import 92% of our food. But a chance for us to reclaim so many of our sacred cultural sites that have been taken from us, that hold such a key point, not just in our practices today, but in our cosmology of our understanding of the world as they are. And so, the scale of this, I want to make sure people see, and I know, some of the people on here have been in communication with people in Hawaii, and their movements have been in solidarity with the Hawaiians for a long, long time. And like I said, this moment for us is crucially important because it allows us to define what kind of world we're going to not just live in, but what kind of world we're going to pass on. We have a chance here to really shift the balance of power, and determine, will they have their strength significantly reduced by seizing back this territory, or will they have consolidated control as they march toward war? These are the stakes, not just for us in the Pacific, and not just for Americans in the imperial core, but for Asia. One of the things that we say in the Hawaiian movement is we don't have just a responsibility for ourselves, for our ancestors, and for our grandchildren and children to get free, to get our independence back, to retake control of our land and our sovereignty, so that we may perpetuate that and expel imperialist forces from our land. But we have a responsibility to everyone in the world whose lives, whose movements, whose communities are continually endangered and harmed by the presence of the U.S. military on our land and the way they use it to train and expand that harm to others, whether it be West Papua, whether it be the Philippines, whether it be Palestine, whether it be anywhere in the world. And so, we have a chance to really change the future for all of us, and not just for us, but for those who come after us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that's actually a great space to end, but I still want to give every speaker maybe 1 or 2 minutes if there's any kind of concluding remarks, but incredibly important intervention. And it wouldn't be a real gathering of political organizers if people didn't give you a list of tasks to do. And what I heard from you, Kavena, is that since August 16th just passed, and we're working towards August 16th in 2029, when the expiration of these different leases will happen. It sounds like to me, you've told No Cold War that we have to have an annual event where we raise these issues and think about how we can build solidarity around this campaign to end those leases, return the lands to their rightful inhabitants, and the fact that this has global implications for those of us who are under the boot of US imperialism across the world and whose oppression is directly tied to those of the people in Hawaii. So thank you all for your incredible interventions. I'm already seeing multiple, again, tasks for you all, because I think at No Cold War, we collaborate with Tricontinental to produce different briefings so we can circulate and educate information about this. And each of your interventions, I think, holds very important information that we need to get out. So I think we can think in the future how we can collaborate around sharing some of the key points of each of your interventions in this briefing. I think, Dehan, you nodded, so that's our task to coordinate at No Cold War. But I want to just, if there are any concluding remarks, I'll go as we ordered ourselves in terms of each speaker. No pressure, because I think everyone gave very fruitful interventions. But if there are any concluding remarks after hearing all our fellow peace activists give their interventions, and I would like to start with Dehan.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you everybody for your time and for your knowledge and for the work that you have been doing in the region. And yeah, it's been a great honor to be part of this panel. And I think this is just like a small step towards the greater exchanges that we need in the region to build a peace movement that can stop this destabilizing of the region. And I think that if we cannot travel, I think the best thing is, of course, if we travel to each other's countries and bring the various struggles that are locally that are happening to each other. But also, if we cannot, there's always Zoom, right? There's always this online space. And yeah, I think it's just the beginning of greater exchanges. And even through this conversation that we had today, I think it becomes much more concrete how we build a peace movement, right? It's not just some sort of abstract no war, but like there's things that are happening in Hawaii, there's things happening in Okinawa, in the Philippines, and I think the only way to stop this destabilizing is to understand what war means very concretely. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Dehan. Then I think we move over to Corazon.
1 minute. I can't help but maybe address Kvena's appeal, and I think it's really important to look at what I'd call golden opportunity of 2029. So let's all build on that. It's very important, also important for us because with the transport of 39 million gallons of fuel from Red Hill is now in the Philippines, in a former base. So, and I don't know where else. And of course, the toxic legacy of the U.S. military presence still there. The denial of responsibility to clean up is glaring, and it's well known. And I think that's the way it is until now. I am also deeply, grateful for good learning experience that we have in the offing in our planning. And I think Becky eventually will have to inform you that we are planning a solidarity and learning visit to Okinawa and to the mainland. And also, we will be participating in the IPAN conference in October, and would really very much welcome the opportunity to be able to address more of the movements in Australia. So I think I'll end there because there are other things that needs to be. And I'd like to thank, of course, Hideki for reminding us about the bilateral treaty. It's not very well known, but I think it is something that we need to put forward in the consciousness of many people, not only in Japan and China, but also here in the Philippines. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Corazon. I think we go then to Hideki. Oh, no, to Max. Max first, sorry.
I don't have much to add other than reinforce all the emphasis on consolidating this network as something which can carry out activities, and from the point of view of the situation in Australia, just having more of your voices echoing here, being heard here, will accelerate the growth of groups here quite a lot. That's all.
Thank you. Over to Hideki.
Yes, I want to say thank you for everyone for your excellent presentations, and I've learned lots. And I'm really made me think about the role of Japan as a colonizer and the legacy that still continues today now in association with the U.S. military bases. And this Japanese colonialism has to be relearned by the Japanese ourselves or themselves. So that's really one important point. And another point I want to say is that this was excellent opportunities, and I learned. And I think I feel that I have the responsibility to convey what I learned today to the local Okinawan people. This is very important. So thank you.
Thank you, Hideki. And we will make the recording available in Korean through Daehan and the ISC, as well as on our YouTube, and we'll share that with everyone after the fact. Jusing, if you have any last concluding remarks?
예, 예.
In the strategy of containment of the whole of China by the U.S., we think that the most likely scenario that can lead to a war is one in which the U.S. uses Taiwan to provoke China into a preemptive attack. So for us, fighting the Taiwanese separatists is of utmost importance. The separatist movement, meaning the current government, is working with anti-Chinese governments in Asia to provoke China. So I think the struggle against the various conservative governments and also in Asia is also important. Through this opportunity, I got to learn a lot, especially from the Okinawan comrade that mentioned the Treaty of Peace and friendship between China and Japan. It was quite memorable. And I got to hear for the first time from the Hawaiian comrade about the struggles of Hawaiians. It was a meaningful conversation that sparked a lot of thought. It was a meaningful space and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, 谢谢. Next we have Shinjik, and then we'll have Karina, and then we can conclude. I think you're muted, Shin.
I learned a lot today. Our organization, we have been doing work around military bases in Korea, but listening to the various work taking place in other countries, I am starting to realize how the military base issue is not just a domestic one, but is connected to other countries in a very comprehensive way. This reshapes the understanding of military bases towards one more centered around peace work. Currently, much of our work revolves around dealing with the damage that surrounding communities suffer. Yet learning about the struggles from abroad, I think we could reframe our movement to revolve more around peace. Thank you for everyone's remarks.
Thank you. Karina last.
I just want to echo everyone that thank you for having me here and allowing me to be part of this very esteemed group, and also for the education that you all have given us today of just so much knowledge shared around Okinawa and the Philippines and Australia, Korea, and as Mika mentioned earlier, I think this is a great call to action for all of us to continue expanding our horizons and connecting our struggles across oceans and continents, and even down from the major ideas of militarism and imperialism down to the struggles of base struggles and against PFAS and against other kinds of contaminants and everything from the bilateral treaties to the RAAs. And like Corazon mentioned earlier, that the struggle in one place also still impacts the struggle in another. When we beat Red Hill, they moved the fuel to the Philippines, so it requires a global strategy for us to confront this and for us to not get tunnel vision on just our own issues, and to remember that other people elsewhere are going to be impacted by this. So we have to win our struggles at home for ourselves and for others, but then also align ourselves with the struggles across the world in order to ensure that it doesn't just move harm from one place to the next. But yeah, a really great big thank you to everyone for participating in this and continuing to share and develop this knowledge.
Thank you. I don't even think I need to do a summary because you did it on my behalf, all of you, and really appreciate you all taking the time. Thank you to the technical support who not everyone can see, from the interpreters to the Zoom host. And I think we have a lot of different things, from exchanges to meetings to campaigns to educational materials that we can produce. And between Tricontinental and No Cold War, I know that we will work hard to facilitate that, as I mentioned earlier. And I want to end with a slogan. As you can see, slogans are very important and near and dear to many of us, is one that I learned from our Latin American friends, which is to internationalize the struggle is to internationalize the hope. And the idea is when we internationalize our various struggles, as you said, Kavena, then we internationalize the hope for all of us collectively to succeed in the face of the gigantic challenges ahead of us. So I think going forward, let's work to internationalize the struggle in order to internationalize the hope. So thank you very much. On that, we'll end this seminar, and thank you everyone for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in other spaces.